The CTMU is often accused of being a cynical ploy. We induce this entire framework just to prove intelligent design creationism. And doesn't that sound like a scary word, right? And it's just Christians want to discredit science and knowledge and reason, and they're using Langan as a swindle to do this. All these eloquent words, they're all just to prove intelligent design creationism. And this charge somewhat makes sense because this paper, the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, a new kind of reality theory, about which our course is named, was actually published in a journal called Progress in Information Complexity and Design, which is an intelligent design journal led by William Dembski, one of the most famous ID proponents. But you'd actually be surprised at the scientific rigor of a lot of the people who are promoting intelligent design. In some cases, it's arguably even greater than those of the academic materialists and Darwinists and so forth. So, design theory is basically, there are these traces its way back to these teleological arguments for God. Is that there is such marvelous complexity and apparent self-organization in the world that surely it would require a creative, intelligent designer in order to bring this about, right? There would have to be a pre-existing intelligence that created all of this order out of a primordial chaos. And that is described, at least allegorically, in the book of Genesis, the traditional account in Judaism and Christianity of the creation of the universe. And intelligent design is an outgrowth of design theory that kind of incorporates modern day probabilistic elements into our theorization about teleological arguments, which is basically just saying it's not specifically positing a designer, but teleology means an end or a purpose. So there has to be some sort of end towards which biological evolution is reaching, according to the proponents of teleological evolution. So intelligent design is a research program based on a value neutral search for how the complexity in the universe arises, and specifically with respect to biological life, is that there's this biological complexity, and this is formalized by William Dembski, who's one of the most famous authors in this space, one of the movement of intelligence design leading spokesmen. He basically puts forth a mathematical argument which says that it is impossible in any way whatsoever that all of this complexity and self-organization could have emerged from any combination of randomness or determinacy. There has to be a self-determining aspect, or either a superphysical being who inheres within the universe as a creative designing faculty, or a supernatural being such as God or a creator that somehow winds up the universe in order such that it accomplishes his design. But either way, to explain the origins and development of life, clearly something more is needed, according to the proponents of this theory, than the standard explanation offered by Darwinism, which is random mutation and random selection. Now, at least most of the people in this space don't deny mutation and selection. They just argue that it is actually directed towards a higher purpose. And this goes back to the Telek principles, that everything actually, according to the CTMU, is directed by this drive for generalized utility. And if you'll remember back to then, we discussed that life originates not only biologically, but metaphysically. There is a primary Telek recursive parameter. There is an item on the will of God that says, we have to create life at some point along this evolution. And that means that the material evolution of the universe is actually striving towards that end. So that is how the CTMU kind of comes into contact with intelligent design theory, is that they're both kind of saying the same thing, is that Chris Langan says, I believe in the truth of Darwinism. I believe in the theory of evolution, but I believe as well in the allegorical truth of creation theory. In other words, he says, I believe that evolution, including the principle of natural selection, is one of the tools used by God to create mankind and to create the animals and the creatures and so forth. God is using evolution as a tool of his creation. and to express his teleology, his will, and his purpose. And then mankind, through this participatory structure that we discussed in our videos on John Wheeler and a couple others, is that mankind is then rendered a participant in the creation itself because of this meumorphism that attaches God to his secondary images. So we are basically, as the terminus, the end of that process of evolution, we are actually turning that evolution backwards, and we're actually now informing God's self-evolution through our observer participation. So we then close the loop, and we are rendered a participant in the creation, and we are directly connected to God, meaning that God is participating in the creation through us. We are his eyes and ears on this earth. And so at that level, Langen says, there's a level on which science and religious metaphor are mutually compatible. Is that doesn't seem to be at odds with a kind of loose reading of either Darwinism, which says all these things about selection and replication and so forth, or with a kind of loose interpretation of religious creationism, which is that God actually intentionally created mankind for a particular purpose, right? So intelligent design theory comes along and says, information is actually needed to specify complexity. Is that if we have a complex process, it actually needs to be informed on how it evolves, or else it's marvelously unlikely to take place. And especially with a complex process such as life, which takes this incredible self-organization of these trillions of cells and so forth, and organelles and organ systems, there's no way that this could come together all on its own and then be able to be replicable and selectable and actually create a organism that is adaptable to its environment through blind natural selection. It is actually guided natural selection by its own intrinsic memory and consciousness that inheres within the universe. So there is a positive mutation, but it's not just that mutation survives. It's that reality remembers the mutations which are most advantageous to its self-evolution, and then it's like, oh well, that was a pretty neat mutation, we should try that out again. And then it does that in multiple of its different creatures, and then reality can evolve, but that's only because it has that intrinsic structure of memory and consciousness. This is what some other theorists, such as Rupert Sheldrake, have referred to as morphic resonance, as the intrinsic memory and consciousness of nature. And that is needed in order to model reality as a self-synthesizing informational system. And then we can find that the complex information that we find in life is actually reducible to intelligent causes. So then we're able to take the intelligence of nature on its own terms and say, oh, well, that's what produced life. So the CTMU actually in some ways disagrees with intelligent design theory, because it says that the designing faculty of nature is not something external to reality that's being imposed on it by a creator, but actually that creator inheres within reality as a creative force, and nature is sort of left to do its own thing, guided by those general teleological processes. So the CTMU trializes intelligence, causation, and information, and says that those are also all basically different ways of talking about the same thing. Is that intelligence is basically specified information. It's the ability to recognize and process information. Information is that which is recognized and processed by intelligence, and causation is the application of intelligence towards a particular end, because we live in a mental universe. So basically, intelligence is the ability to recognize and control reality. Information, or infocognition, is the reality itself, and causation is that which is caused by intelligence and information. So these are all, there's kind of a joint definition where in infocognition, where you have this infocognitive medium which is acted upon by these linguistic transformations of SCSPL, by this telic recursion. And that means that there's a well-defined model in which all of those concepts are related, and reality is actually programming itself to basically provide its own model for that theory. And then it's able to specify a fundamental medium that is able to support and realize the ends and purposes of that linguistic transformation. Is that there is a actually drive within reality, as we said, for the proliferation of life. And that's what reality does. It figures out how to create life, it figures out the best way to do it, and then it does it. Intelligence, information, causation. They're all one and the same. It figures out how to do it. Information. It gets the information. It figures out how to do it. Information, intelligence, and then it does it. Causation. And that's a 3-step process. It's information, intelligence, causation. That then and then that causation becomes new information for the further proliferation of life. So it's a closed loop that leads to the greatest possible teleological causation for the reality system to create new life, basically. And that's how biological evolution is moving forward from moment to moment. So the critics of intelligent design theory claim that it's actually unfalsifiable, meaning there's no way to prove it wrong. And that's in some sense true, but that's only because they don't have the specified model of the CTMU. And that's a little hypocritical as well, because there's also no way to prove correct or incorrect the theory of evolution outside, or any scientific theory for that matter, outside of the CTMU, because you run into this problem of induction. And in all fairness to the intelligent design proponents, their theory actually seems more plausible even without this model theoretic framework, just based on intuition, than does Darwinism. So they still have the upper hand, though, and it's quite hypocritical that scientists would say this about intelligent design theory when they've failed to meet these epistemological criteria as well. So the intelligent design program, Langan says, is actually perfectly consistent with science. That's a moot point. However, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the correct one. And in fact, it is by definition incorrect because it doesn't yet have a model. There's no way to interpret and apply the intelligent design theory and make good predictions with it because we don't have the CTMU. We don't have this general logical framework from which we can induce a broader epistemology, a broader study of knowledge, and then work inward and fill in the gaps using our content knowledge from intelligent design. So lacking a fundamental model, we're unable to make much use of intelligent design, but within the CTMU, it actually becomes basically the fundamental assumption of its framework is that there is intelligence in design inhering within nature, and this is very important to the way that we have to think about reality. It's not just a Trojan horse for religious ideology. It's actually, there's pretty strong theoretical structure that would suggest that we live in an intelligently designed universe. And there's basically no intelligent argument to the contrary, at least not within the CTMU, which is the domain in which you would formulate such an argument. So there's no fundamental model that if there's no fundamental model for reality, such as the CTMU, then again, perception, cognition, and so forth would be unlikely to occur. There would be no explanatory infrastructure. We can't have this correspondence between human cognitive perceptual syntax and reality itself. And therefore, reality's perceptual stability would be impaired, and there would be no fundamental model of the universe. But since there is a fundamental model of the universe and it's telling us that intelligent design theory is true, or at least worth looking at, then we ought to look at that quite closely. And so Christopher Langan says that the CTMU actually has a meta-Darwinian message, which says that actually the way that the universe evolves is a lot similar to how Darwin said that life evolves, is that there is a self-replication and self-selection. He says the universe evolves by hological self-replication and self-selection. Furthermore, because the universe is natural, its self-selection amounts to a cosmic form of natural selection. But by the nature of this selection process, it also bears description as intelligent self-design. The universe is intelligent because this is precisely what it must be in order to solve the problem of self-selection, the master problem in terms of which all lesser problems are necessarily formulated. This is unsurprising, for intelligence itself is a natural phenomenon that could never have emerged in humans and animals were it not already a latent property of the medium of emergence. So basically, the reality and nature is intelligent in much the same way that we are intelligent. And thinking, we came from nature, we came from the universe, and thinking nature and the natural universe aren't intelligent is kind of asinine if you think about it. It's like I've used this analogy a couple of times. It's like a kid, he can't understand why he's so smart, but his parents are such dunces. It's like, we came from reality. Reality is smarter than us, actually, and an object can't actually achieve anything which was not already a property of its medium. An object does not displace its medium, but embodies it and expresses its underlying syntactic properties. So that means within the syntax, within the rules and structure of reality, is a very primordial form of intelligence that is able to design and create the universe in accordance with their teleology. So the whole controversy seems to hinge on terminology, not and natural selection are true at the same time. And there's actually a way they mutual contact with one another and put them within the same referent domain and see where they overlap. And much like the way we did with syndifionesis, is we say that the difference between intelligent design or creationism and natural selection actually and natural selection actually entails a common medium. And that means that there is a more general relationship that has both these aspects of natural selection as well as intelligent design. So there's not really so yes, we can use creationism as a metaphor religiously for this aspect. We can also use natural selection or Darwinism as a metaphor for thinking about this from a biological perspective. But we have to understand that at the ultimate level, these are the same, and that everything is created by God through the evolution of the reality system. So there is both an evolutionary and a creative aspect to this causality. And again, through the recursive cross definition between laws and their states, through telic recursion, reality is able to generate more infocognitive complexity over time. And that's basically the fundamental mechanism by which reality evolves. So that's pretty much it. The CTMU says that by its self-generative, self-selective nature, which follows directly from the analytic requirement of self-containment, reality is its own designer. So that means that there is a creator, but that creator, it's sort of a panentheism where everything is in God, but God actually extends beyond that. But that means that God subtends and underlies the entire material universe, and God is not something separate from nature, but is actually a part, or nature is rather an aspect of God and is an overflowing of his being. And therefore, God has complete creative power and dominion over nature. But nevertheless, nature still has still functions on its own without like the direct arbitration of a human-like entity. There is a human-like entity at the fore of all of reality, but it's not quite like the command and control that we've been told, but actually it's more like God is actually sharing his authority with nature and sharing his being with nature, sharing his energy, and then reality is able to function as its own designer through God. Through God is like the medium, and nature is the expression. So, and anything that is a property of the medium is anything that is a property of the expression, as we just said, is already a latent property of the medium. So anything which we can ascribe to reality, reality is a part of God, and therefore we can also ascribe to God. So other features of the generative grammar of reality imply that reality possesses certain logical properties traditionally regarded as theological or spiritual, and that to this extent, the self-designing aspect of reality is open to a theological or spiritual interpretation. Seems reasonable enough, is that if reality is creating itself and there is a supernatural creator who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent, is able to form a direct relationship through the meomorphic mapping with each of his secondary images, meaning that humans are actually made in the image and likeness of that global operator descriptor, it seems reasonable enough to have a theological or at least a spiritual interpretation of that being, that is the creator of the universe. Let's be real. That is basically what we're talking about when we're talking about God. And also that God is the creator of the evolutionary process, and is thus, you can account life and consciousness as well to his creations, as well as the entire universe, of course. So the CTMU doesn't weigh in on that. I mean, Christopher Langan has weighed in on that and said, yes, God is a logical requirement, but you don't need to interpret it that way. You can just say, this is a property of nature, and there is a kind of underlying level to nature, but you can't have an anti-theological or anti-spiritual interpretation, because it's basically a matter of terminology, but you can't, it's not really coherent to say, oh, well, that's illogical because you believe in God. Actually, it is more likely to work the other way. It's illogical because you don't believe in God, because God is the word that we have for such a being. But the CTMU, being a logical theory, doesn't try to cram that down anyone's throat. And not all semantic, it's basically a matter of words. Not all semantic permutations need affect theoretical structure. So there's still that structure. You can call it whatever you like, but basically it's God. God created the universe, and God is responsible for the complexity of the created universe as well as biological life. So basically, God is an intelligent designer that exists as reality itself. And in light of the CTMU, Langan says we actually disprove atheism. In light of CTMU, this is now a matter more of logic than of taste. And to the credit of the atheists, who don't really deserve that much credit, in my opinion, but to their credit, it also disproves certain or maybe even most formulations of theism that don't incorporate this self-programmatic aspect of the global operator descriptor. But nevertheless, the CTMU says that God is the creator and ruler of the universe, is that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and that we can actually, if we are not interdicted, for example, by mortal sin, then we will have the opportunity to reunite with God once we are retracted from this mortal coil and are retracted upward along the mapping that created us. So we actually should get right with God and should establish a personal relationship with God so that we can participate in the best way in his evolution and dynamical life through us. Is that we are part of God, and we're not the whole thereof, but we are directly connected to the greatest source of power and knowledge in existence. So the CTMU yields new ways of looking at evolution in teleology. It is actually a model of teleological evolution, which means evolution that is directed towards an end. And it gives us a lot of interesting insights about cosmic and biological evolution that we'll get into in the next series of lectures. This is very, very interesting to me. The CTMU's formulation of evolution is very interesting. And it says the CTMU establishes model theoretic symmetry by providing a seamless blend of theory and universe in which the biological world can itself be modeled by physical embedment. This alone entitles it to a place in an evolutionary debate. And of course, there's so much more. It does not only deserve a place in the evolutionary debate, but is kind of the final explanation for all of the evolutionary debates that have occurred over the last 100 years, which have actually been more about semantic ambiguity than model theoretic structure. So anyway, thank you. Take care. I hope you enjoyed.